Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Guy Other, Orbis Protect's Chief Executive, and I'm delighted that you've managed to join us on this webinar today. This is our first webinar, so we practiced and practiced, and hopefully everything will go off smoothly. And it's good to see a number of familiar names as well as some new names joining us today. We wanted to put on this session to share some of the latest thinking about security and compliance, which is becoming more prominent as lockdown starts to ease. As a company that operates right across the UK, we've seen at close quarters the impact that the lockdown has had on businesses in every corner of the country. And I know that we're not alone in these experiences, and our feeling that businesses will need to think and act differently is not unique. As lockdown eases and the talk of a restart becomes clearer, it's right that we reflect that many organisations will start on that journey, unfortunately, from a very different place. So with insolvencies increasing over the next few months, the safety and long-term security of vacant buildings will feature, we think, amongst many organisations' plans. So, questions of how we are ensuring that properties remain compliant will be in front of organisations' minds, and we want to touch on these with my fellow panelists today. So, over the next 45 minutes, you'll hear from Mike Reddington, who's Chief Executive of the security industry's main trade body, the British Security Industry Association, about some of the key issues around protecting and securing property assets. So welcome to Mike. And we're also joined today by Andy Grieve, who is a senior risk consultant at Aviva Insurance, who will provide us with some insight into what the insurance industry is looking for in situations where property is being passed on to insolvency practitioners. So once again, I'd like to welcome Mike and Andy and thank them again for the time that they spent with us today and preparing for this presentation for you. We think it's important as well that we'd like to hear any questions that you have. So these can be submitted through a chat function, which I think should be on the right of your screen, which everybody will have access to. Please do post any questions that you have, and we'll keep an eye on them and look to respond to those at the end of the 2-minute the two presentations, which should take about 30 minutes. And at the end of Mike's presentation, the end of Andy's presentation, just a very brief poll, just with some very simple questions for just to gauge the feel of the audience about some certain topics that we think that are relevant. I'm pleased to say that you'll also we'll be recording this and we'll share this with all attendees afterwards. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mike to say a few words. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Guy. First of all, I'd just like to thank Guy and the Orbis Protect team for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And what I'd like to do is that I'm not sure if people can see my presentation on the screen yet, because it doesn't appear on my screen at this stage. Thank you. Is that what I'd like to share with you is a BSIA perspective on the COVID-19 returning to work, some of the things to plan for and some of the actions that potentially need to be taken. Before I actually go into that detail, I thought it'd be useful just to actually share a little bit about who the BSIA are. Is that we're a not-for-profit trade association that represents the professional security industry. We've been established for over 53 years, and Orbis Protect have been active members for over 24 years. We are made up of 16 different sections covered under the different areas of manpower, electronic and physical security, and our members represent circa 70% of the security industry in revenue terms, and we're recognised as the voice of the professional security industry. In working with our members, we identify best practice and from that create codes of practice, which quite often turn into industry standards. We also have two separate divisions called Safer Cash, which focuses predominantly on cash and valuable in transit members, and Safer Gems, which is focused on the jewellery industry. And these are intelligence sharing services that work very closely with the police authorities in sharing data on incidents and crimes and patterns and potential people that are undertaking those crimes, and have seen significant positive results and reductions in crime as a result of that. We also have a wholly owned subsidiary called Skills for Security, which focuses in on the electronic apprenticeship training, and we're the biggest training provider in that sector. And we have another division called CITO, which is focusing on physical security training. We have some very strong key partnerships across government and police. We have a great relationship with the Department of International Trade and Defence and Security Organisation, with the SIA, who's the regulator for security officer licence holders, and JSAC, it's a Home Office, and RISK, which is an industry community that works collectively with government. We've done a lot of work around industry lobbying or lobbying on behalf of the industry with the UK government. And one of the key successes that we achieved through that was the key worker status, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, I think, on the next slide. If I just now talk a little bit about the current landscape, is that I think, as Guy touched on previously, one of the main topics that everybody is having to deal with at the moment is the coronavirus pandemic. I think everybody's been impacted by this on a global basis, and are coming to terms with a new way of working, and in some areas a new way of living. Is that in addition to that, today we have over 30% of the UK workforce paid by the government during as a result of the furlough scheme. That's effectively circa 10 million people that are being funded by the government. We've also seen a significant increase in the unemployment rates, with over 2.1 million people currently employed, with a forecast for that to increase. If you listen to various economists, they're forecasting a recession with different levels of severity. And I think, unfortunately, as a result of that recession, we do believe there will be some businesses that may not survive through these challenging times. So health and safety remains a top priority for both the government and employers, in terms of for employees and the general public. And we've also seen the working arrangements forced into the digital sphere virtually overnight, as we've seen businesses move their employers to remote working, and the platforms like Teams and Zoom become common, and these type of webinars have come commonplace over the last 3 months as we adapt to a new working environment. If I just expand a little bit further on the key worker clarification, one of the key things for us as an industry was to obtain the classification or clarification of key worker status for those operating in the professional security industry. That would allow them to enable to continue to provide security for vacant properties. They've also been involved in providing security at supermarkets, at various warehouses, supporting the COVID test centres, and in multiple other areas. If I now move on to just looking at the first steps to return to work, we're seeing lots of announcements from the government, which is effectively changing on a daily basis. And it's critically important that we stay abreast of what that advice is. I think one of the things is a key for us is organisation is key as we begin to consider the actual return to work. Is that one of the things that is being asked is that before we suddenly bring all our remote working employees back to work, is that do we actually, can they continue to work remotely? And if so, should we actually change that in the short term? Or should there be a bit of a blended approach of people returning to the office and people remaining to work remotely? Is that some of the first sectors to actually return are manufacturing and construction, but we're now seeing other sectors slowly return. I think one of the last to return is likely to be events and hospitality. And I think they've been severely impacted throughout this. I think there's a few considerations that we need to do as employers with our employees. Is that, do they need to use public transport to return to work? If they do, should we actually consider staggering starting and finishing times so they're avoiding very busy periods on public transport? I also think that there needs to be a recognition and actually educating our employees that they should be prepared for change. It is going to be different when they return to the working environment. The way we did things is not the way that we're going to do things going forward as we begin to adhere to the social distancing approach and also the actual working environments in terms of appropriate hygiene behaviours. Health and safety is a key priority, I think, for all employers. And there is an adoption here. You can use a process called the procedure, which is stepped out here in terms of protect your staff and public. That's a key part of any employer or any business or any building owner, is the protection and safety of your staff and public. And one of the key areas of actually dealing with that is actually ensuring you do risk assessments, but those risk assessments need to be applicable to each individual business, each individual building and business, because they do differ by building and businesses. The key to it is operating safely when you're actually in those environments, and that part of that could be controlling the access and exit of buildings, and also controlling the level of occupancy within buildings. It's critical that the organisations comply with the HSE guidance that's being communicated by the government. And also, it's worthwhile evaluating the reopening of businesses. Can they reopen fully, or is it a partial reopening, and gradually building on that as time progresses? A key area is discouraging bad practice, so to make sure there is positive hygiene practices in place, that people are using hand sanitizers on a regular basis. It loses into the next subject is actually utilizing space and good hygiene. Is there a requirement to actually move workstations further apart? Do they need perspex screens in there? And really just controlling the occupancy of actually the building. The key also part of it is actually reassuring the staff. Is that there's a lot of people that are concerned about returning to work. Many of them have been working remotely or been on furlough for 3 months, so they've now become used to working in a different environment, and they're returning to a workplace that's going to be different than what they left, and the processes and procedures are going to be different. And then the final piece as an employer is ensuring that your buildings that employees and public are attending meets the COVID secure government criteria. One of the things that you can do is that the government have created a 5-step checklist, which you'll see here on the right of the screen, which you can actually download from the government websites if required. Or alternatively, you can actually access the BSIA website that has a dedicated COVID advice page that signposts links to lots of the relevant government information. But in addition to that, it's worthwhile considering, what else is it we can do as actually employers. One of them is identifying vulnerable employees. And in line of that, can we delay their return to work? And can we do other things to support them that actually mitigates the risk that they face? Also, it's worthwhile considering, if we can't bring all of the workforce back to the workplace in one go, is it worthwhile considering asking for volunteers of employers who are on furlough to come off furlough first? As I said previously, arranging the workplace, so it's giving the distance between the workstations, and also abolishing any sharing of workstations or potential hot desk approaching. Again, considering implementing temporary bans on face-to-face meetings, encouraging staff to do conference calls or webinars, similar as we're doing today, and also continuing to monitor the NHS and Public Health England measures, and wherever possible to adopt the Trace and Track app. As I touched on, I think mental health well-being of both employees and some of our clients has never been more important than it is today, as they're feeling stress in a different way. And the way of dealing that could be adopting the Think T, which is travel. Again, can our employees have their own travel to work? Do they need to use public transport? What else can we do to support them? Also, within the environment, is understand what our current environment is and how we need to adapt that to actually meet the challenges of COVID-19, and the emotions of our employees. As I said earlier, this is a different world that they're entering back into. And after a significant period of remote working, their emotional stress may be higher than we know. They also may need to be dealing with the loss of loved ones. And do we need to have a support package in place for those employees when they return to work? So I've covered a wide-ranging number of points there. Hopefully some of those have been useful to those attending. So I will close now and hand back to Guy. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much for that, Mike. I think there was some very interesting and particularly relevant advice there, returning to work or returning to the workplace from a sector which, as we all know, unfortunately has been very severely affected by the coronavirus. So thank you for that, Mike. Right now, I'm going to hand over to Andy, and Andy will give us the insurance sector's perspective of the current crisis and the risks associated with it. So, Andy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Guy, and thank you for the opportunity and invitation to speak today. As Guy mentioned, I'm Andy Grieve. I'm Aviva's technical specialist for security, and I've been part of the risk management team here for the last 25 years or so. You'll be pleased to know I'm not about to put up any stats or numbers about Aviva, as I'm hopefully you're aware of a fairly well-known brand. What I will just say is that we have a specialist partner network in the risk management space, and Orbis are one of our partners, and obviously deal with the vacant property protection. So I don't know. I haven't got much of a presentation in terms of slides, but I do have some notes to go through. It's not that there's nothing visible. There is something visible. There we are. So we know that properties may become unoccupied for a number of reasons, and vacant buildings, it would be fair to say, have for a number of years been a real issue for insurers. The current economic conditions mean that there will unfortunately be some businesses who do not emerge from lockdown, and that will inevitably mean more vacant properties, which some of the people, yourselves in the audience, may be assuming responsibility for. So the hazards presented by such properties obviously need to be assessed, and appropriate measures then implemented to reduce the potential for loss or damage. Now, most commercial insurance policies will include an unoccupied building's condition. So I thought today I would just talk through what the contents of these policy conditions typically relate to, and also try and articulate why we ask for some of these measures. And it may be helpful to consider this under the headings of the different insured perils, which are up there on the screen. So if we look at fire, first of all, we know that every year there are thousands of fires in empty buildings, many of which are started deliberately by malicious persons. Arsonists will use combustible materials within or in the vicinity of the premises as fuel for the fire. And that's why we ask for loose combustible items to be removed from the premises and grounds. Sealing all letterboxes and similar openings is commonly mentioned in these policy conditions, together with the removal of any delivered mail or flyers. In long-term unoccupied buildings, a considerable amount of mail can accumulate, which, being paper products, are obviously combustible. And this can also contribute to the appearance of a property, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So having considered fire, if we think about water damage or utilities, perhaps in a building, unoccupied properties are more susceptible to damage from water ingress and burst water pipes. If mains water supplies remain on, particularly during colder winter months, pipes can burst, caused by expansion of water as it freezes to form ice. An escape of water from a burst pipe can cause significant property damage. It's a fairly well-known statistic that now water damage is at least equal in terms of its monetary impact to the insurance industry, as fire has always been. Furthermore, the theft of water apparatus and pipes and malicious acts can lead to extensive resulting damage if the valves are not isolated and systems drained. So that's why we ask for services in a building to be isolated, and in the case of water in particular, for all water carrying apparatus to be drained down. Probably worth also noting that there's an exception here where power or water is required to support any existing fire or security protection systems. The requirement then to isolate doesn't apply to that part of the supply. Moving then on to theft and malicious damage. The background really, high scrap metal prices have increased the incidence of theft of non-ferrous metals in particular, and a single incidence of metal strip out can cost many thousands of pounds to reinstate. Without good surveillance, this type of theft is often not readily detected, and may only become apparent when rainwater enters a property and causes damage to the building or its contents. So insurers have long referred to layers of security and what they call the onion skin principle, which is sort of looking at a site from the outside and working in, which is why so security for vacant properties needs to consider the site in its entirety. And suggested measures will begin with perimeter fences, walls and gates. These provide the initial line of defence, so checks should be made that they are intact. Providing concrete blocks at entrances to the site should be considered. This is an excellent way to prevent vehicular access. Moving on then to the building perimeter, securing doors and windows using good quality locks is a fairly common sense measure. Probably worth considering changing locks to doors if the premises have been recently vacated by a tenant. And for long-term vacant properties, consideration should also be given to covering accessible or vulnerable windows with plywood sheets, or more often than not now, a proprietary steel security screen system. Accepting the fact that given time, any security measure can be overcome, it may then be down to detecting an intrusion that has occurred. So temporary alarm systems are available for use inside buildings, and a particularly useful product is the rapidly deployable monitored CCTV systems, which can be supplied by companies such as Orbis. And these are obviously then used to protect open spaces and approaches to a building. CCTV camera systems can both detect and are also useful to deter intruders, but to be of meaningful value, activation of any electronic security system should be remotely notified using a secure monitored connection to an alarm receiving center. Probably one bit of guidance I would just throw out as well at this point is to say that if you do take on responsibility for a building and there is an existing permanent alarm, early intervention and taking over any maintenance contract at that stage will be no doubt a more cost-effective measure. And that applies particularly to fire protection systems, fire alarms and sprinkler systems, obviously that are in a building will definitely be only present if it's a very large site. And so early proactive arrangements to take over what's there would be of benefit to you. So assuming building reuse is anticipated, the attraction of metal-based building services can be reduced by using forensic marking products. Whilst not a physical barrier against removal, when notices as to its use are posted on site, forensic marking has been proved to be one of the most effective security measures in terms of deterrent. And on the final bit on security would be just a note on guarding services. If using services of contracted security guards, the minimum requirement then is that they should hold licenses issued by the Security Industry Authority. And of course, to be of any real value, a permanent guarding arrangement is necessary as opposed to mobile patrol services. On the subject of cost, of course, the temporary alarms, any electronic system, I think will compare very favourably with the ongoing cost of employing a security guard. So certainly the insurance industry would be very keen these days to promote the technology-based solutions. So having put our measures in place, ongoing management procedures and controls are then necessary, and a point that typically appears in insurers' policy conditions will often relate to carrying out regular internal and external premises inspections. So these inspections will enable the responsible person to check that the premises remain secure, and if there are any defects or signs of unauthorized entry, these can be promptly repaired. So we always suggest that a log of these inspections is maintained, and these days, again, with the use of technology, it's not as cumbersome as a physical logbook. Certainly operatives that from companies like Orbis will be carrying PDAs, which will enable real-time smart recording of those visits. And of course, upon completion of an inspection, premises need to be resecured, and any fire protection or security systems should be set so they remain operative. In addition to the increased fire load from delivered mail, etc., buildings with a rundown appearance or those that show signs of neglect are more likely to attract unwanted attention from malicious persons, vandals, or those intent on fly tipping. And it's therefore important that there's an ongoing maintenance program, both for protection systems within the building to make sure they remain fully operational, and also in respect of the external appearance. So there should be ongoing arrangements for grounds maintenance. Now, I've put up there as our final point, legal liability, just to talk about this very briefly. Property owners have a legal duty of care to third parties by virtue of various legislation, including the Occupiers Liability Act. And this includes a duty of care to authorised and invited persons such as surveyors, contractors, estate agents and potential buyers, but also in some circumstances trespassers. Now that's obviously a controversial issue in terms of people who are trying to break into a property, but trespassers may include children who are simply using the premises or grounds as an unofficial playground. So it's important that health and safety risk assessments are reviewed to take into consideration the unoccupied status of the property, and some practical measures that should be taken. Again, come back to securing the buildings against unauthorized entry. We've already discussed this in terms of security, but going on to this controversial topic of trespassers, it needs to be shown that somebody's gone to some trouble to break into a property if a claim is then to be successfully defended, or a significant element of contributory negligence argued. Posting durable warning signs such as fragile roof or dangerous building keep out, potential access points to the site would be recommended, and in particular areas that include asbestos or cement fibre roofing. Any broken glazing in buildings that's not already boarded over to prevent access needs to be either fully removed or externally boarded to prevent it falling. And that needs to extend to clearing any broken glass from around the site. We've talked about removing loose combustible items, but this needs to extend to include piles of rubbish, scrap metal, etc., which may contain potentially dangerous objects. And inside the building, considerations would include any missing or damaged stairs and or the presence of holes or unprotected openings. If electrical systems remain operational, they of course need to be inspected and tested by a competent electrical contractor. So to conclude, really, any in management procedures for any insolvency practitioner or other organisation taking responsibility for a now unoccupied building, I just say it's important to review the adequacy of the premises security and fire protection measures when a building becomes unoccupied. Existing levels of security may have been adequate whilst the building was occupied, but that would have reflected, perhaps with an industrial site, the long hours that was operational. And then those levels of security, of course, may not be adequate for what is now an unoccupied property. So just to wrap up, an acknowledgement perhaps that I've not provided here much COVID specific advice, and in some ways that's deliberate. What insurers are looking for can be summarized as robust management procedures and controls, including regular internal and external inspections, a scheduled maintenance program, and good security to prevent unauthorized access. Those fundamentals haven't really changed. Now I've just put up there just a couple of sort of web addresses. We have spent our last 3 months producing a number of pandemic related loss prevention standards, and you can access them via the web address there. And if there are any questions about the insurance industry's response in general, then our trade body, the ABI, have a coronavirus hub on their website. Also, just to say, many of our specialist partners have been busy making additional services available at this time, and obviously these range from specialist disinfection services to thermal imaging cameras for screening for elevated body temperatures. And if you go onto the Aviva Risk Solutions website, they'll be available to you there, and I'm sure Orbis would be pleased to discuss with you. Thank you very much, Guy.
Thank you, Andy. That was terrific. Thank you. And I think what's particularly clear there was some very practical, very practical solutions to what unfortunately, as the economy contracts, for some will be some very sizable losses, and interestingly also the use of technology, Andy. So thank you for that. So we have some questions that are coming in. There are also 2 polls, one which was distributed after Mike's presentation, which was, thinking of returning to work or managing vacant properties, if you considered the following for peace of mind and reduction of risks. And then what do you consider to be the most difficult issues surrounding managing vacant property in your context? So if you could take some time just as we go into the question and answer session, and I'll sort of go through, perhaps get a couple of questions each for the guys that have joined us today, that would be appreciated. And again, we'll feed back those results to you as well. So Mike, there's a question that's just come in on relating to, and I hope this isn't a precursor of anything, but it might be. Somebody's asked, what advice would you give organizations taking on large portfolios of vacant properties? Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, I think the key things I touched on earlier is that as you take over specific properties, if it's a portfolio, you need to undertake a risk assessment specifically for that individual property. And then once you've done the risk assessment, is to ensure that any of the security requirements that's identified through that risk assessment are actually implemented. I think Andy touched on it previously, is that what was a suitable level of security for a building that was occupied during the day and is now vacant 24/7, the current system in place may not be appropriate to give the same level of security protection. So it's critical that the risk assessment is done specifically for each individual building.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Mike. And a question for you, Andy. You outlined 4 main areas of risk: fire, water damage, theft and malicious damage, and legal liability. Which one of these risk elements results in the biggest claims made by clients in your experience, and Aviva's experience?
Right. Okay. Well, it's quite clear at the moment. I can't draw a graph, I'm afraid, but that obviously fire is a fairly static feature or steady feature for us. Water damage is very much on the increase, so those two would be comparable in their effect. Theft and malicious damage, I'm pleased to say, in some respects, is a tiny proportion when compared to those other two. Certainly, this is not pandemic related comment, but our current biggest issue is definitely the escape of water in typically high-rise buildings, from boosted water supplies, things like that, with also in very high-end residential properties, certainly the cost of escape of water damage in all its forms is the current biggest challenge we face. I can't really give an answer in terms of legal liability. Obviously, injury claims are another big area for liability insurers.
Yeah, excellent. All right, thank you very much, Andy. So if I can just choose between perhaps one more quick question each, just a little bit conscious of the time. Someone's asked for you, Mike, are there any risk assessment templates available that could be shared? And can I get a copy of your presentation after the session?
Okay, well, to answer the first one then, yes, there are some very good risk assessment templates available that the government have actually created, and you can access those from either visiting the BSAA website on bsaa.co.uk and accessing the COVID-19 advice page, which is signposted you to the government appropriate website, or alternatively, if you want to visit hse.government.uk, then you can access, and the templates are very good, I have to say, and they're generic, so you can apply them to whatever type of building that you are potentially undertaking a risk assessment on. Right. And as far as the copy of the presentation, I'm happy for you to have a copy of the presentation. If you'd like to reach out to your contact at Orbis Protect team, then I'm sure they would be happy to forward that on to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. And then one final one. We couldn't get away, Andy, with one that isn't coronavirus related. What are the legal liabilities in terms of what's the legal liability that sit with the person responsible for the property in relation to the coronavirus? And I guess that might be cross-infection, perhaps.
A good question, and I don't know exactly how I would best answer that.
With that one.
So I suppose, I mean, in terms of from a policy cover angle, obviously we cover legal liabilities to employees or the public for damage or bodily injury sustained, and that would include illness. Right. So I suppose the answer in many ways is where a customer, and in this case, no doubt that's going to be a property owner, have breached their duty of care, and to do that, they'd really need to be in contravention of any government guidelines or advice regarding safety at work. Then there would be cover under the employer's stroke public liability insurance. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, we do have. I would refer you at that point perhaps to, in order to continue to follow government advice, on the Aviva coronavirus hub, there is a pandemic planning loss prevention standard.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. There are other questions that have been asked, and we can perhaps try and sweep those up later. And if anybody has something that they'd like to ask of us or Andy or Mike in the meantime, then please refer them to us, and we'll get back to you on that. So thank you for everybody for their excellent questions and for the filling in on the polls. And again, we'll report back on that, so that might be interesting reading for everybody. A recording will be made available to anybody that's been unable to attend, so they can hear what's been discussed today. So we hope that we've given you something useful to think about today. Please do stay in touch with us on any security matters. We hope to host another one of these in the future and be able to meet some of you again. It goes without saying, but I will say it, thank you very much to my fellow speakers who are all doing this as an extracurricular activity, so to speak, to Mike and to Andy, and thank you to you all for taking your time with us at Orbis Protect, and I hope you have a great rest of the day and clearly stay safe. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Mike.
Cheers.